Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to really get into some foundational ideas that, well, they pretty much shape our modern world.
Absolutely.
We're kicking things off with a quote from Edward Bernays' 1928 book, Propaganda. It's quite something. He wrote that we are, quote, governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely grabs your attention, doesn't it? It's a really bold opening to a book that basically lays out Bernays' whole view on how public opinion actually gets shaped behind the scenes.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really dive deep into Bernays' vision. It was controversial then, it's still controversial now, but undeniably influential. We want to unpack his idea of this unseen mechanism that molds what we think.
And then look at how he saw these ideas playing out in the real world. You know, business, politics, even things like social work and art.
Right. And this isn't just some dusty history lesson. I mean, Bernays' insights, they give you this unique lens to look at all the information, all the choices that bombard us every single day.
You might find yourself seeing things a bit differently after we unpack this. Seriously.
Okay, so let's start with this big idea. The invisible government. Bernays puts it out there pretty bluntly. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society.
He doesn't pull any gumshoes.
No. And he says the people doing this manipulation, they make up an invisible government, which he calls the true ruling power. I mean, that sounds, well, a little scary, right?
It does sound ominous, absolutely. But for Bernays, this structure wasn't just, some shadowy conspiracy. He actually argued it was necessary for society to function properly.
Necessary? How so?
Well, think about it. If every single citizen had to deeply analyze and vote on every single candidate, every single issue, it would be pure chaos, right? Utter confusion, as he put it.
Okay, I can see that. Information overload.
Precisely. So Bernays' point was that society kind of implicitly agrees to let this invisible mechanism do some of the sorting, to narrow down the options, whether it's political candidates or, which brand of toothpaste to buy.
So it's like we collectively, maybe unconsciously, sign up for this filtering process just to cope.
That's his argument, that it's almost a functional necessity in a complex world. The really provocative bit isn't just that it happens, but that he argues we sort of consent to it just to avoid being overwhelmed.
That adds a layer. It's less a top-down imposition and more like a system that evolved. And he really hammered home how complex society is, didn't he? All these groups.
Oh, absolutely. He paints this picture of society fragmented into thousands of groups, social, political, economic, racial, religious, you name it. And each of those has tons of subdivisions.
So he gives examples, right? Like really specific ones.
Yeah, everything from the League to abolish capital punishment all the way to the National Pickle Packers Association.
Pickle Packers.
Okay, right. His point was just the sheer variety of these influence networks. These groups are where opinions form and spread.
And then he adds this idea that the groups interlace. That's key. He uses the example of John Jones.
Right. John Jones isn't just a Rotarian. He's also in a church group, maybe a political party, a charity, his professional association.
A golf club?
A golf club, exactly.
Yeah.
So an idea or opinion John picks up in, say, his professional group, he might then carry it over and share it in his church group or at the Rotary meeting.
Ah, so it's like a web. Ideas jump between these overlapping memberships. It's how things spread through the masses.
Precisely. It makes influencing large numbers of people possible without having to reach every single individual directly. You reach the group leaders or tap into the group's identity.
And he connects this to historical changes too, right? The Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, he points to the trio, the steam engine, mass printing, the multiple press, and public schools. He argued these things shifted power away from kings and towards the people.
Making mass approval suddenly crucial.
Exactly. And if you need mass approval, you need ways to shape mass opinion. And for Bernays, that tool was propaganda. Which brings us to the word itself.
Yeah, let's talk about that word, propaganda. It has such a negative ring to it now, and even back then, apparently.
Oh, definitely. He knew it had an unpleasant connotation,
Yeah.
but he tackles it head on. His argument was basically that propaganda itself isn't inherently good or bad.
It depends on the message.
Right. It depends on the merit of the cause urged and the correctness of the information published. He wanted to reclaim the word.
How did he justify that?
Well, he pointed to dictionary definitions of the time, and even an article in Scientific American that argued for restoring the word's original sort of neutral meaning.
Which came from?
From the Catholic Church, actually. the 17th century Sacred College de Propaganda Fide, an institution set up purely to propagate the faith. For him, that was the original wholesome meaning.
Interesting. So when does it cross the line for him? When does it become bad?
It becomes vicious and reprehensible, he says, only when people consciously and deliberately disseminate what they know to be lies, or when they're aiming for effects that are prejudicial to the common good.
So it's about honesty and intent, not the act of persuasion itself.
That's the core distinction he makes. And, he drives this home by pointing out how common he thought propaganda already was. He famously claimed that about half the front-page news stories in the New York Times back in 1928 were actually propaganda.
Half? Like what?
Well, he cited headlines like, 12 nations warn China, real reform must come before they give relief, or Pritchett reports Zionism will fail, or even, our living standard highest in history, says Hoover report.
Wow, most people would just read that as news.
Exactly. But Bernays argued these were carefully crafted messages, designed to push a certain viewpoint or create a specific impression, often accepted by readers as just, objective facts or spontaneous events. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so if propaganda is everywhere and not inherently bad, how did Bernays think it should be done? He talked about a shift, right? An old way versus a new way.
Yes, this is crucial to his whole thesis. The old propaganda, he said, was clunky. It was based on this outdated idea of the mind as just a machine reacting to simple stimuli, a mechanistic reaction psychology.
Meaning
direct, repetitive commands. Think simple slogans like, eat more bacon, or big, bold print shouting, you buy O'Leary's rubber heels now. It was all about directly attacking the individual's sales resistance, like a battering ram.
Okay, very direct. So what was the new propaganda then? How is it different?
The new way was much more subtle, much more psychological. It was based on understanding group dynamics, social structures, and underlying motivations. Instead of assaulting sales resistance, it aimed to remove it.
Remove it? How?
By creating circumstances.
Yeah.
By engineering situations where the desired idea or action seems to arise naturally from the person's own thoughts or the group's consensus.
Okay, give me an example. The bacon one.
Right, the bacon example is classic. Old way. Eat more bacon. Signs everywhere. New way. Ask, who influences what people eat? Well, doctors do.
Oh, okay.
So the new salesmanship, as he called it, would involve getting physicians to publicly state that bacon is part of a healthy breakfast. You leverage the authority of doctors, knowing that large numbers of persons will follow the advice of their doctors.
So you're not telling me to eat bacon, you're having my doctor suggest it's a good idea, and then I think, oh yeah, bacon sounds good.
Exactly. It feels like your own idea, prompted by trusted advice within a context you accept. It's about shaping the environment, not just shouting the message.
That's clever and kind of sneaky. What about the piano example?
Same principle. Old way, buy a piano. New way, create the desire for a space that needs a piano. Let's promote the idea of the music room as essential for a cultured home.
How would they do that?
Organize fancy exhibitions with famous interior decorators. Show off rooms featuring beautiful pianos alongside, say, expensive tapestries. Invite celebrities, a famous violinist, a popular artist, a society leader to attend opening events. Get press coverage.
So you make the music room fashionable.
Precisely. You make it the thing. Then people start thinking, our house really should have a music room. And what goes in a music room, a piano, it feels organic, like their own aspiration.
It bypasses the feeling of being sold to.
Completely.
Yeah.
It aligns the product with deeper desires for culture, for status, for fitting in.
Okay, this leads us right to the person orchestrating all this, the Public Relations Council. Bernays basically invented this role, didn't he?
He really did shape it into a profession. He argued it became necessary because modern life was just too complex. Businesses, governments, organizations, they all became increasingly dependent on understanding and shaping public opinion. Public opinion became, as he put it, the unacknowledged partner in all broad efforts.
The unacknowledged partner. I like that. So what does this PR council actually do? What's the process?
Well, first, they analyze the client deeply, understand their problems, their goals, but also, critically, ensure the client's product or cause isn't basically unsound.
Ah, so it's not just spin. They need something real to work with.
Ideally, yes. He gives an example of an old-fashioned orphanage losing donations. The PR council wouldn't just run ads. They'd figure out why donations are down. Maybe the public subconsciously dislikes the institutional model and wants a more modern cottage plan.
So the PR council advises the orphanage to actually change its structure to match what the public wants.
Exactly. Change the reality first, then communicate it. Step 2 is analyzing the public, identifying all those different groups we talked about, figuring out who their leaders are, what motivates them.
Mapping the terrain.
Right. And only then, step 3, do you formulate policy and communication strategy. Shape the client's actions and words to gain that public approval.
Where did this profession even come from, according to Bernays?
He traced its roots to the early 20th century, particularly the era of muckraking journalism that exposed corporate abuses and things like insurance scandals. Corporations suddenly realized, whoa, we are totally out of touch with the public.
They needed help managing their image.
Desperately. He points to companies like Metropolitan Life Insurance starting to do things like public health surveys or turning their headquarters into a picturesque landmark. It was about building goodwill proactively.
And he thought this was becoming a real profession with ethics.
He believed so. He argued it was developing an ethical code, much like law or medicine. A reputable counsel, he said, would refuse a dishonest client, a fraudulent product, or an antisocial cause.
Because their own credibility was tied to the client.
Exactly. Trust was paramount. Okay, so how did these PR pros actually do their work? What were the techniques?
He mentions a couple of key methods of interpretation, continuous interpretation.
Yeah, that's about managing every point of contact with the public to consistently build the specific desired impression, often unconsciously. Like the New York Central Railroad, always projecting this image of efficiency, elegance, comfort, maybe personified by their famous spokesman, Chauncey Depew, who just embodied that.
So it's the whole vibe, consistently reinforced. And the other one, dramatization by high spotting.
That's more about grabbing attention with a specific symbolic detail, making a big deal out of your skyscraper being 10 feet taller than the highest skyscraper in existence.
Creating a memorable hook.
Right. Or, say, for gelatin, funding research to prove its health benefits, testing it dramatically in hospitals and schools, and then broadcasting those results to influential leaders and groups. It's about making news.
And he also talked about indirect approaches, right? Not always targeting the end consumer.
Yes, like the luggage industry. Instead of just ads saying, buy our bags, they campaigned to get railroads and steamship lines to improve baggage handling. Better handling means less damage. It means people are happier with luggage in general.
Clever. Or the shoe company creating a foot protection bureau.
Exactly. Promote general foot health, educate the public about proper care, and naturally, people will realize they need better shoes, perhaps the ones you happen to sell. It builds credibility and addresses a need.
This also connects to his ideas about competition changing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Mass production and mass advertising created new battlegrounds. First, intercommodity competition. It's not just Ford versus Chevy anymore. It's stone versus wood for building materials.
Oh.
Or oranges versus apples for breakfast fruit.
Industries fighting industries.
Right. And then interindustrial competition, what he called the war on the dining room table. Basically, everyone is competing for the same consumer dollar.
And if everyone's mass-producing similar stuff, price becomes the only weapon, which leads to races to the bottom.
Exactly. So Bernays argued you need to add some other attraction, some element of originality. That's where things like aesthetics come in. Suddenly, typewriters aren't just functional, they come in cheerful colors.
It adds value beyond the basic function. He had that great story about hats, right? The large hat fit.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic case study. The millinery industry hat makers were apparently facing ruin because small, simple felt hats were all the rage. Nobody wanted big, elaborate, expensive hats.
So what did the PR council do? Direct ads saying, big hats are back?
No, that's the old way, the new way. They organized a glamorous fashion fete. They got famous artists, high society women, influential fashion editors involved.
Creating an event.
A major event. These prominent figures selected the most beautiful new, large hats, models wore them, and news of this exclusive high-status event was spread everywhere. Suddenly, large hats weren't just hats, they were fashion, endorsed by the elite.
And sales went up?
Apparently, they surged. It created the trend, made the large hat desirable again.
That really illustrates the Korean circumstances idea. What about crises? Did he cover that?
He did. He contrasted a failure with a success. The Hudson Motor Company lost $1 million in stock value, a huge sum then, because of a false rumor they couldn't effectively counter.
Just denying it didn't work.
Right. But then he highlights the Beechnut Packing Company. They faced a damaging rumor, too, about a potential hostile takeover or something. Instead of just issuing a denial, what do?
The Beechnut Day.
Exactly. They orchestrated a huge hometown celebration honoring the company president for his loyalty in refusing to sell the company. It was a positive, emotionally resonant event that completely drowned out the negative rumor with a story of integrity and community pride. Far more convincing than a simple, "No, that's not true."
Wow. It's about changing the narrative completely. So, okay, it's clear Bernays saw this applying way beyond just selling products, politics, for instance.
Oh, definitely. He thought politicians were way behind the curve compared to businesses. He quotes a political strategist, Emily Newell Blair, who calculated that a typical speaking tour cost something like $15 per potentially swayed vote.
Which she called?
Utterly inefficient and antiquated. Just not effective communication for the modern era.
So, what was his advice for politicians? Just run campaigns like businesses run ad campaigns?
Sort of, but with more substance, ideally. He stressed the need for honest platforms and careful budgeting, like business, but also to use these techniques of emotional appeal and circumstance creation in a coordinated way. Even something like kissing babies, he said, is pointless unless it genuinely epitomizes a definite plank in your platform. Otherwise, it's just noise.
Don't just kiss the baby. Make it mean something about your family policy.
Exactly. And he strongly advocated for leaders to be creators of circumstances.
Yeah.
Don't just talk about why a low tariff is good because high tariffs raise prices.
Use something.
Yes. Yeah. Stage low tariff exhibitions in major cities showing the price differences. Get prominent people to publicly boycott high tariff goods like wool clothes to dramatize the cost. Then give your speech about it once people are already paying attention and engaged with the issue.
Grab the headlines before you make the argument.
Precisely. He tells that great anecdote about Thomas Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia.
The independence announcement.
Yeah. In 1918, he deliberately shifted the announcement of Czechoslovak independence from a Sunday to a Monday. Why? To ensure maximum newspaper coverage via the international cables. He understood media cycles even then. His quote was supposedly, "Cables make history."
That's incredibly forward-thinking for 1918, understanding the mechanics of news flow.
Absolutely. And Bernays even floated the idea of formalizing this within government, suggesting roles like an Assistant Secretary of State for Public Relations or even a cabinet-level Secretary of Public Relations.
Wow, a Secretary of PR. To do what?
To interpret America's goals to the world, and also to interpret the world and American public opinion back to the government. A trained expert to manage that flow of information and perception.
That's a radical idea. And his analysis didn't stop at politics, right? He looked at women's activities, too.
Yes, he saw women's groups as becoming incredibly powerful, especially when they got organized and used these modern propaganda techniques. He pointed to the suffrage movement as a prime example.
They really mobilized opinion.
Massively. And he detailed how later coalitions, like a committee of 13 major women's organizations, the League of Women Voters, YWCA, WCTU, and others, were effectively using PR methods to push for legislation.
Like what kind of laws?
Things like welfare legislation, the 8-hour workday for women, even a bill focused on maternity and infant welfare. They learned how to lobby, how to shape public discourse.
And he gave some creative examples there, too.
He did, like Women's Consumer Group fighting a proposed tariff increase. They didn't just write letters. They rented an empty store on a fancy street in New York and set up an exhibit showing products with their current price tags right next to what they'd cost under the new tariff. Very visual, very direct.
That's smart, making the impact tangible.
Yeah. And beyond politics, he noted women's clubs influencing everything from health education and art appreciation to homemaking. He mentioned a cooking school run by the New York Herald Tribune that filled Carnegie Hall, showed the huge public interest, skillfully cultivated.
Filling Carnegie Hall for a cooking class. That says something. And he loops this back to propaganda, saying even social service campaigns are a form of it.
Essentially, yes. Campaigns for dental hygiene, for creating parks, fighting tuberculosis, lowering infant mortality. They all aim to change public habits and opinions for a specific goal. In his framework, that's propaganda, ideally for the common good.
It broadens the definition significantly. What about art and science? How did he see propaganda fitting in there?
He saw it creating opportunities, actually. For artists, as businesses started competing on aesthetic values, not just price, there was more demand for artistic input into mass-produced goods.
Like the colored typewriters or maybe fancy packaging?
Exactly, or commissioning artists for designs like modernist pianos that drew attention, or the Cheney Brothers Silk Company gaining prestige by associating their fabrics with famous artists and museum exhibitions like at the Louvre.
So business becomes a patron of the arts, partly for PR value.
Right, and he thought museums often failed here. He kind of criticized them for being too passive, like morgues, instead of active leaders and teachers. They weren't using propaganda effectively to engage the public.
What did he suggest they do?
Things like adapting designs from historical objects, say, Greek vases for modern, mass-produced items like China, bringing beauty into everyday homes. Or museums actively dramatizing historical periods through lectures, events, loan collections to schools. Making history come alive.
And for science.
He felt industries had an obligation to share scientific progress, and that propaganda was essential for marketing new inventions, getting the public comfortable with change. He cited companies like AT&T and GE using the new technologies of television and radio broadcasting to do just that.
Okay, so this really covers almost every aspect of society. Let's talk about the mechanics then. How did he see the tools of propaganda evolving?
Well, he recognized that any communication channel could be used, and the value of different channels changes over time. He noted that public meetings, for example, were becoming less potent because of cars, radio, newspapers, offering other ways to get information and entertainment.
The propagandist has to adapt to the media landscape.
Constantly. He saw magazines as key, especially for reaching specific groups, like banks providing financial advice articles to women's magazines. Lectures still had value, but more for their repercussion, the news they generated, than the live audience size.
And radio.
Radio. He called it a most important tool. Its future was still a bit uncertain in 1928, but the potential to reach millions simultaneously was obvious. A game changer.
Motion pictures, too.
Definitely. He saw films as powerful standardizers of ideas, habits, even fashion and language. And then there's the power of personality itself.
Oh, so?
Well, an individual's personality could create circumstances. Think of Charles Lindbergh's flight, creating immense international goodwill. Or, conversely, circumstances could create a personality like Theodore Roosevelt becoming a national figure, partly due to the events of the Spanish-American War. Personality itself could be molded and projected.
It's all interconnected. So wrapping this up, Bernays saw these methods becoming more sophisticated, more pervasive. Did he think people would become immune or resentful?
He acknowledged that the public was becoming more aware of how propaganda worked. But ultimately, he believed people must respond to the basic appeals, desires for food, security, belonging, amusement, beauty, leadership. These are fundamental human drives.
So the methods might change, but the core psychological buttons remain.
That was his conviction. He believed that propaganda based on falsehoods or antisocial goals would eventually undermine itself, that truth and the common good had a kind of staying power. He had, perhaps, a surprising amount of faith in the public's ability to eventually sort things out, even while arguing they needed expert guidance.
What a fascinating tour through Bernays' mind. From this idea of an invisible government managing chaos to the deliberate crafting of desire for everything from bacon to pianos to political platforms. Yeah. It's quite a framework.
It really is. Powerful and for many, deeply unsettling. Leaves us right where we started, but maybe with more questions. That final idea he puts forward of society as a leadership democracy administered by the intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses.
Yeah.
As you go about your day consuming information, making choices, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How much of what you think and desire is truly your own and how much is, well, engineered? Something to definitely chew on.